Good evening. My name is Johanna Koljonen and you are watching Crosstalks, a collaboration between two of Sweden's leading universities, KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology, and Stockholm University. We are airing live, and at the end of this first conversation, in roughly 37 minutes, do take advantage of the unique opportunity to ask questions of our participating guests. You do so by calling us on Skype, where our name is Crosstalks TV. You can also discuss the different topics on Twitter, where our handle is Crosstalks TV and our hashtag is Crosstalks. As long as humans have existed, there has been conflict between us. Dealing with the consequences of war, waging war, preparing for war, or trying to avoid war, these are core concerns in the governance and planning of most societies. Indeed, this machinery is so vast that the military industry in many places plays a big part in jobs creation, tax generation, and economic growth. These gains often made in parts of the world not immediately touched by the atrocities of armed conflict. Are wars really an inevitable aspect of the human existence? Could we manage to create a truly peaceful world, or at least to decrease the risk of war? Please welcome to discuss tonight's topics Saeed Mahmoodi, Professor of International Law, Stockholm University, Maja Fjaestad, Associate Professor at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology, welcome, Magnus Reitberger, Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Stockholm University. Tonight, we also have a very special guest with us in the studio, a former Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs, who, among many other prestigious assignments, headed the United Nations Monitoring, Verification and Inspection Commission from 2000 to 2003. On the academic side, he has a Ph.D. in international law from the University of Cambridge and has been an Associate Professor of International Law at Stockholm University since 1960. Please welcome Dr. Hans Blix. Saeed Mahmoodi, there seems to be a number of ongoing conflicts in the world where national and international laws are completely set aside. What's your view on the state of international law today?
Well, the fact that there are conflicts and during the conflicts international law cannot function as it is meant to do is a fact that should be accepted in the sense that normally in this area of international law, that is the area of use of force, states' interest to achieve their goals, let's say, are so high, are so important that they not normally and in the first place think about following the rules of international law. Although international law is well advanced as regards both prevention of war and also as regards conduct of war when the war has started, and even now these days what happens after the war, how to deal with consequences of war. In all these areas we have a complex of rules which states have accepted. But as I said, when it comes to the war itself, when it's going on, normally the necessities of war, military necessities of war, and political, let's say, objectives of states of going to war are so important that they don't, in the first place, try to respect the rules. Rules are there as a framework, and they are observed to the extent that the states or parties to the conflict can afford to do that. I may also add that one problem, particularly in today's world, is that most of the wars are internal wars, domestic wars, where you don't have two states, and you have, let's say, political movements which are either against a dictatorship or for any reason they are fighting to let's say, achieve their own rights of self-independence, and you cannot normally put the same rigorous, let's say, demands of respecting international law on this type of movements as you normally can do that on states which are established.
I realize in this conversation we will well, at least to the non-expert, it will be a challenge to try and remember that the historical ideas of war are probably quite different from today's reality, and I do realize that these laws are also made in an older world. Maja Fjaestad, the access to energy sources has been at the center of international conflicts through history. What do you feel we can learn from that today?
Well, energy is a very vital part of any society, and we have many recent examples that energy have been a driving force in international conflicts. Of course, the Gulf War, but we can also look into history and other types of conflicts. If we look at the colonialization of Africa made by Europe, energy and natural resources was definitely a part of the incentives there. But we can also look at how states act in a situation of war, and I would claim that energy is a very important part of that too. If we look at Sweden during World War II, for example, we were highly dependent on coal, and we couldn't import very much. The possibilities to import were largely restricted. So what Sweden did was to have negotiations with Germany, and we could import coal from Germany, and in exchange we exported a large amount of iron ore to Germany, which of course went directly into the German weapons industry. And I think that shows how very strong the dependence of energy is. And after World War II, the goal to be self-sufficient in energy issues was very leading for Sweden. And to establish, for example, nuclear power was from the beginning a part of self-sufficiency. The hope was to do this with domestic uranium. Now it ended up with imported uranium. So what to learn? I would say that would be the possibility maybe to be flexible about energy. And I would also say that sometimes you hear that the solution for our energy system would be a technological solution. We have to find the right technology. But I would maybe argue that our energy system exists in a geopolitical context. We have to take the international politics into account. So we have to.
So I'm just going to throw a big one at you immediately. If a country was truly self-sufficient in energy, would it be much less likely to go to war, do you think?
No, I think that's very interesting. I mean, both sides can be argued. It can be argued that trade, of course, is a peacekeeping asset. And I mean, that's really the basis behind the EU, of course. So energy trade is very important to maintain stability. So I think that it's two coins of two sides of the coin, that in a situation of war, self-sufficiency becomes very important, but to avoid war, maybe trade is more important.
Interdependence as a method for peace. Interesting. Magnus Reitberger, before states decide to go to war, there is usually a certain amount of negotiations and debate, whether openly or behind closed doors. What would you say are the main ways for state to justify the act of going to war and to use force against another nation?
Well, I would say that there is a remarkable degree of consistency in the way states seek to justify wars. They go back a long time in history. By far the most common reason that states appeal to is of course national self-defense in various forms, and this is also the only just cause that is recognized by international law, and it's uncontroversial that states have a right to defend themselves. Exactly what it means to defend yourself and what you can defend, however, is more controversial. Some states claim the right to defend fellow nationals in other countries, for example. And historically, it has been common to try to argue that you can defend the religious minorities that belong to your own major religion and so on. And there's also the issue of whether you can defend yourself in a preemptive way. Many states claim to have a right to defend themselves preemptively in anticipation of attacks, which is of course very controversial and opens a Pandora's box of problems. The second strand, which has increasing importance, I think, is the protection of human rights. It's a very important and growing an argument that is growing in importance. It's also more and more recognized that this could justify wars, although this is very controversial. Many major players in international politics do not agree with this view that human rights can justify wars. And also historically speaking about the third strand, that would be kind of like a retrospective or restorative view of justification of war. You try to restore justice or reclaim something that has been unjustly lost due to war. Reclaiming lost territory, for example, or punishing, historically speaking, states have claimed the right to punish other states for violating international norms and so on.
I guess maybe I'm naive because I've always lived in peaceful times and countries, but peaceful times, I should say. I don't think there's such a thing as entirely peaceful countries. But I wonder, is there even such a thing as a just war? I mean, you answered this question very well, but I need to ask the sort of amateur question, which is, Is there a definition for a just war that people can agree on?
There is a strong degree of consistency in how states have tried to justify wars, and this goes back thousands of years, actually, this tradition of thinking that wars can be just, and you can find this in ancient antiquity, and it's important thought in Christian thinking as well, that wars can sometimes be just under very restrictive circumstances. And such. And,
so maybe.
Yeah. It's very difficult to find, I think, any particular war that lives up to all the expectations we may have of what is a just war, but they can certainly be more or less just. Perhaps.
Hans Blix, you're shaking your head, so we should start with a follow-up there. Is there such a thing as a just war?
It depends whom you answer. If you ask St. Augustine, he would say yes. There are some who defend God or you have the order from God. If you ask, on the other hand, Machiavelli, he writes that just war is what the prince decides is just and good, and he can do it any time. I think it's more interesting to look at what are the practical cases. When are you likely to have war? And I can see three different situations which traditionally could cause war. And the first is a fight about borders. I mean, we are territorial creatures and we defend our borders, and states defend their borders. It's a very common reason for war. The second is land grab. You get more pastures if you have cattle, and you get more country to land to cultivate or to steal from. And colonialism was part of that, grabbing land. And we can see how Saddam Hussein tried to grab Kuwait, and how Russia is now grabbing to get back Crimea. The third group, I would say, is ideological, religion and ideology. They fight for God or they fight for an ideology. And I think that all the three of these are really reducing in number after the end of the Cold War. There's no one to start a war of ideology or religion today. Well, maybe the Al-Qaeda will do it with the jihad, but they are not strong enough to be of interest. Then you could have other new ones. And you talk about energy here. Energy, I think, is a fairly new element for causing war or conflict. The Arab oil embargo was in 1973, and it's right, as you said, that stimulated efforts to energy independence. That's what the French started to build up a nuclear power that gave them 80% of their electricity, and Sweden and other countries as well. So energy, yes, has been a cause of war. You can see, or at least a conflict, you can see also the fighting about where pipelines are to go. And today you can see that energy independence, which you asked about a moment ago, that plays its role. In the United States, you have had the shale gas revolution recently. And it means that the United States is no longer dependent upon the import of natural gas from the Arab world. The US has become somewhat more independent of Saudi Arabia. And if they were not, it would have been harder for them to discuss with Iran today.
But I still have to, I'm sorry, I have to return. You said borders, land grab and ideology are the traditional ones. Certainly in the media narratives, certainly in, for instance, the American understanding of reasons to go to war today, ideology is quite key. And partly, I think, still religion, although perhaps more often it's a reason for civil wars than wars between states. But also this idea of spreading democracy by arms, which I think many of the Western countries are engaging in. Is that not war for ideology?
Well, do you think that it really was to spread democracy that they went into Iraq in 2003?
Let's ask you that question.
It was something they claimed, but I think that was a minor part, actually.
So that's more of a narrative construct
so.
than an actual justification.
I think so.
Yes.
Well, you have another, as you mentioned, Magnus, you mentioned the protection of human rights. Now, that's relatively new. And in the United Nations, they had adopted the famous resolution, R2P, the responsibility to protect. And that was after the genocide in Rwanda, which was a shame to the world and a shame to the UN. They said this cannot go on. The world and the UN has the responsibility to do something. So they said that, yes, the UN should then intervene first diplomatically, and secondly, in the last resort, they could also do it with weapons, but after decision of the Security Council. Well, that's fine. I mean, that shows the concern for human rights. That is good and welcome. In reality, I think it will prove very difficult to get the troops and the money in order to suppress a genocide unless there is oil or some vital interests in place.
We haven't had a great track record with the United Nations. I speak very grandly for us all, but they haven't had a great track record in that field. What about you others? What major risk factors for future wars do you see between the powers of the world? Said Mahmoudi.
Well, the very fact is that war today is very different even from war, say, 20, 25 years ago. In international relations, the preference of states, if they want to go to war, is to be a very quick war and give results and have very clear, so to say, objectives. I think I would like to join those commentators who believe that today, compared with some 2-3 decades ago, states do not go to war in the first place just to achieve their foreign relations, let's say, objectives. And if they do, if states decide to go to war and they are not forced to go to war because of internal let's say, disturbances, as is the case in many cases just now in the world. It is, as I said, for very quick objectives. I fully agree with what was said about the difference between today and the time before 1990 as regards the interest of the global interest as regards what is going on inside a country, the fact that sovereignty, which was so holy concept in international law, both internal sovereignty and external sovereignty, they are not definitely as important as they were before. That means that the world has accepted that there should be a limitation to what states can do within their territories and outside their territories. And because of that, because of this consciousness at the global level, we can expect that, and we can hope, indeed, that that international community, which is a very, I must say, abstract concept. When we say international community, it depends who uses this. If the United States says international community, it means United States. If Iran says that, it means Iran and like-minded countries. But let's say a Swedish international community, in our way of looking at it. If international community considers that there is a need to intervene, one can hope that today is by far easier to do that. And protection of human rights is a very good cause. And we have seen that states, in fact, have come to agreement in some exceptional cases to act. The case of Libya was, I think, a very good example of the principle of responsibility to protect states showed that they can come to agreement, even the Security Council, despite the fact that they had very differing interests. Now it's not the case in the present conflict of Syria, unfortunately. There, the world has just stayed there and looked and haven't done so much. But
there's an idea that the price would be too high.
Well,
so there's also a kind of economy in the values we're trying to protect.
These aspects are all there, but I think today is, of course, as you say, the price is very high, but it was not in the very beginning. If the world had reacted effectively in the very beginning of the conflict, probably we could have stopped it already there. But unfortunately, there was no political consensus on the issue, and probably because of the way responsibility to protect was abused, in my view, in the case of Libya, because Russia and China accepted that this is a new concept, this is a new principle. All right, let's go and save people, civil population of Libya, and they did it. But what happened was that French and British troops went far beyond the mandate that the Security Council had given them. And this was not really meant from the beginning. So that was the reason why Russia said, all right, if that is the way, we don't cooperate in this case, and with the unfortunate consequences that we face today.
On this show, we speak a lot about the environmental challenges faced by our generation. And And in that context, one often speaks of the destabilizing effects of the new migration patterns, which is a fancy way of saying that people who suffer terribly will want to move to secure resources if they can. How likely do you think an increase in armed conflict is for reasons like that, environmental reasons? Maja?
That's an interesting question. You mean that the enlarged migration due to climate change, for example, would lead to armed conflicts?
Well, the destabilization of entire regions, and I don't know. I think that maybe it would. There's an inevitable process where the nation state, for instance, becomes less important if large groups of people move around, as I think they will. But also perhaps that regions will be destabilized because of internal conflicts about resources.
Well, the American military have begun to discuss the risk of armed conflict due to the environmental changes. So that's perhaps one way in which the US public gets acquainted with environmental dangers. However, I doubt that it's a bigger threat. I think when you ask for what is the biggest threat to peace in the future, I would say it is the possible confrontation between the United States on the one hand and China on the other hand. The US Marine recently ordered 10 new nuclear submarines to the cost of $17 billion. It was not for Russia, was not for Ukraine they did that. It is for a potential conflict with China. And you can see how the US made an alliance with India, how they placed troops in northern Australia, in Darwin. They recently made an agreement with the Philippines, and they have assured the Japanese that they will support them, or the Senkaku Islands, etc., and with South Korea. So the US, I think, is wisely, and when Obama wisely seeking a détente with China, they have nevertheless said that just in case, we had better have a sort of containment. They deny it's containment, but there's there. And the Chinese are clearly irritated. So here is a danger. In Asia, I think, is the biggest danger. They have also potential dangers within India and China. They have the border in Himalaya, over which they fought a war. And you have, and of course, possible conflicts between Pakistan and India, as in the past. So
and
that's
the number of nuclear nations involved.
Today
is
we
alarming,
watched the Ukraine, and it's horrible, but I think that the long-term conflicts, potential conflicts, are in Asia. And I think the US present attitude is relatively positive. I'm not so critical of it, but I think that's where the big dangers are.
This is a terrifying prospect. Let's see if we can inject some hope into this conversation. Joining us via Skype should be John Horgan, an American science journalist whose most recent book is The End of War, published in 2012. Welcome to Crosstalks.
It's great to be here.
John, you argue in your book that going to war is not inevitable human behavior, that war could be regarded as a scientific problem that we could solve. Could you elucidate this a little?
Sure. Well, the reason I wrote my book was because about 10 years ago, I did some surveys on people's attitudes toward war and found that the overwhelming majority of Americans, but then I've also done these surveys in Europe, believe that war is inevitable, that it is just a permanent part of the human condition, and we may be able to reduce it or ameliorate it in some way, but we can never get rid of war or the culture of war, of militarism. And when I asked people why they had this very fatalistic attitude, they cited various theories or explanations of war, including the idea that war is in our genes, it's a consequence of human biology. And another theory, which has already come up in this discussion today, that war is the inevitable result of competition for resources, whether that is land or, in the modern era, fossil fuels. And so I wrote my book to look carefully at these and other theories of war. And the conclusions that I reached are that war, first of all, does not go back to the beginning of Homo sapiens. War is a relatively recent byproduct of human social organization. It really only emerged in a persistent way 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, which might sound like a long time ago, but there are some scientists who think that war is tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years old, possibly even millions. And then there's also the fact that once war emerged, it's very sporadic. So it becomes very intense in some regions and then fades away in those same regions. And we're talking about primitive tribal societies as well as very complex civilizations right into the modern era. If you look around the world today or at the history of the 20th century, you can see that war is not something that's persistent, which you would expect if it's really a consequence of biology, but that it comes and fortunately it also goes. I also look very carefully at what I call the Malthusian theory of war, which is the idea that war happens when there are too many people competing for too little food or water. And this has become very popular nowadays because of fears about climate change, that climate change will cause, for example, large-scale droughts, water shortages, food shortages, and people will inevitably fight over this. And you can find examples of wars over resources, of course, and once wars break out, resources become extremely important, but resource scarcity does not hold up as a good explanation of war historically.
John,
So
I have to ask, you said that war is a byproduct of human social organization, and 7,000 or 8,000 years is not that very long ago on a sort of biological timescale, but it is rather much on a historical timescale. Are you arguing for an anarchist society with as little social organization as possible?
Well, humans lived for the first couple of hundred years of their existence as hunter-gatherers who were nomadic and lived in small bands, anywhere from 50 to 100 people, roaming around chasing animals and following crops or plants as they became edible. And there is no evidence of large-scale conflict among these societies or among many of the first Neolithic societies. Then you do get very clear evidence of war emerging in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, in Turkey, as you got more complex societies emerging. And war broke out in various regions for probably any number of reasons. And what makes war as such an insidious cultural behavior, and that's how I see war, is just a kind of dysfunction of culture, is that once it breaks out in a region, it's very infectious. So you have one very warlike society, and it starts attacking its neighbors, and those neighbors can either flee or they become warlike themselves. So I see war as being a kind of what Richard Dawkins would call a meme and a cultural infection that has turned out to be extraordinarily persistent, even though so many of us recognize its destructive and harmful effects. But there are many societies historically that have figured out ways to turn away from war and militarism. And my hope is that humanity as a whole can do that in the future. And I see that as a...
I think because then an answer to this destructive meme would be a better story. Magnus, I think among many, at least young people, at least in the EU, there is a vague but widespread feeling that nations today are so interdependent of one another through shared economy and trade, as Maja also mentioned before, that the risk of war is diminishing. Are we being unreasonably optimistic?
Well, I think you're alluding to the so-called commercial peace hypothesis, which argues that nations that trade a lot and become economically interdependent are much less likely to go to war. And this has been a very common idea since the 18th century, that trade is a bringer of peace between nations. It brings reconciliation and shifts the focus away from military competition to commercial coexistence and commercial coexistence. There is some evidence of this, but there are also striking failures of this theory. I think the most famous one being, of course, World War I, where you had a very high level of trade between societies. Prior to World War I, it had a very little restraining effect on deliberations about going to war. And the second problem also, of course, is that the most common type of war today is domestic wars, civil wars. And of course, in civil society, we are highly dependent on each other from an economic point of view. So in those cases, you could say that economic interdependence may actually promote war in some cases. I think there are three basic reasons why trade would diminish the risk of war. The first one is deterrence, that you would harm yourself by going to war with your trading partners, harm your economic interest. The second one would be that trade has a civilizing power, that you learn to associate with other people when you trade with them instead of just interacting on a distance. It's easier to demonize someone that you don't associate with on a regular basis. And the third reason would be that you get a stake in the prosperity of other countries. The prosperity of other countries is not a threat anymore when you trade with others. It's the source of your own prosperity. So the trade, that economic growth is no longer a zero-sum game. There's lots of debate, lots of research about this thesis. I'm just going to mention two problems with it. I think the first one, and since I already mentioned World War I, it kind of assumes that political leaders care deeply about economic issues. And it also assumes that political leaders don't make major mistakes about the effects of war. And if you study the history of war, you also study the history of mistakes, because political leaders are wrong all the time about trying to predict how war will end and what the results of war will be. They are wildly optimistic about what will happen in wars. They frequently make flawed predictions and so on. So in that sense, if leaders are wrong all the time, they're also going to be wrong about the economic consequences of war. They will consistently underestimate the negative impact of war. And also the political leaders themselves may not care about the economic consequences of going to war. They may care about other things like national prestige, or in some cases, in many countries, the military, for example, military establishment has a significant influence over foreign policy, and they promote military objectives. They don't think much about economic objectives, perhaps.
Also, of course, there's this what is called the military-industrial complex, that there are a lot of financial interests tied to military spending. Indeed, there are those who argue that war, or at least preparation for a war, is very good for the economy. Does anyone have any reflections on this? Is that a valid point at all?
Well, I'm convinced that the military-industrial complex exists in many places. It was not only about the US, which Eisenhower was the first to talk about it, but in many other places you will find that a debate about rearmament in Sweden today, there are lots of military people who are urged that it should be done. So I think there is something in that. I think there is also in what you said, that the habit of quarreling with each other it's an intellectual one. It is something that is not inevitable. I agree with John Horgan there. I think that this is a social phenomenon. And when we look at angry boys on the schoolyard and they are lifting their arms and so forth, well, it may not be very far from a fight. But if one does it, then the other does it the same way. And we see the same thing. I like sometimes to talk about the difference between diplomatic talk on the one hand and the military body talk on the other hand. And the body talk is much more dangerous. But let me say about it's not just that I think war is less likely. I think also violence has gone down. For instance, dueling was something entirely acceptable and honorable in past. It is no longer today. Spanking of children. I was spanked as a boy, and I probably damned well deserved it. But anyway, spanking, I never spanked my children, and modern parents don't spank children. So here's an element of violence.
It's illegal in many countries.
We have a lot of abuse of women, abuse of children still, but it's something that we react against. And I think this is a fine thing. And as to interdependence, yes, I think that interdependence is vastly greater now than it was at the end of the First World War. I mean, Japan and Chinese and Japanese don't like each other very much, but they are enormously complementary. And if you take Ukraine today and Germany, you hear many of the more belligerent people say that it's terrible that Germany imports so much gas because they cannot then be tough against the Russians. Well, the Russians will not get any euros if they don't export gas to Germany. So I'm not sure that maybe it's a blessing in disguise that they are dependent. It keeps down the conflict somewhat. It's horrible as it is. But if we were to have a military clash between Europe and Russia, I don't think it's going to happen.
At least it buys some time. If going to war is a big hassle, there's at least more time for negotiation that the trade would make. The trade creates a space where you'd have to figure out other ways of financing your society and so on. Maja, Fjaestad, have there been technological advancements as a result of wars that in your view would not have been possible without the extensive military spending on research and development?
Well, that's often argued that military spending is important for technological development, and we can of course ask ourselves what is particular about war. Well, one thing is that there's very strong state support for technological development. If you have a particular problem that needs to be solved, you get a lot of money, you get a lot of resources. War can also act as sort of a joining force that researchers and engineers can join around. We can see in Germany, Second World War, they really needed to find some way to synthesize gasoline from coal. They had no access to oil. And this technological task was solved very quickly with state support. We can also look at the Manhattan Project in the United States, a gigantic project to develop the first atomic bomb. 100,000 people were employed in the Manhattan Project, and the best researchers and engineers sort of went there, and of course they did manage to create fission. But I think the interesting question would really be that why can't we gather around another problem? If we had 100,000 researchers and engineers trying to defeat poverty or cure cancers, maybe actually the gain for humankind would be larger.
Said Mahmoudi, what is in your opinion the most promising development in international institutions and laws in recent years?
Undoubtedly, the limitation on the concept of sovereignty, which has led to the fact that the topic of human rights and respect for human rights have become really current in discussions everywhere. And also it has led to the fact that the concept of immunity, which is a central issue in international law, that because states are sovereign, because they are equal, they are not subject to each other's jurisdiction. They can do whatever they want to do within their own, let's say, territories. This concept has weakened also strongly in the sense that it has changed more or less to the benefit of responsibility, that states can be responsible today much more than what we could speak about many years ago. This is particularly the issue when it comes to criminal responsibility of states. The fact that a dictator or a ruler, a political ruler, wherever, not even a dictator, may be held responsible for his orders, for his acts at a time when he had the power. As you know, we have in recent years have had two important developments in the field of international law when it comes to this particular issue. One thing is the acceptance, general acceptance of the fact that there can be, and now we have, an international criminal court, a concept which was impossible to speak about 1990. I mean, it was a sort of miracle that during the 90s this became possible and states accepted this concept. This is one thing, which means that there is an international jurisdiction to prosecute people who are responsible for atrocities and violations of human rights or humanitarian law. The other thing is also the fact that national courts, even national courts, have started using universal jurisdiction more and more, which means that states can prosecute a person who is suspected of a grave breach of international law, no matter where this breach has happened, how it has happened, and if this person has any connection with the state which decides to, let's say, persecute this person. This is a great development, I think. I mean, it gives enormous possibility for states to exercise their jurisdiction in cases which is good for the promotion of human rights in the world. All in all, I must say that today international law has moved from from focusing on the concept of state sovereignty, state immunity, let's say order for rights and obligations between states to individual-focused order, which tries to promote those values which are so important.
This is very hopeful indeed. I think it's time for questions. Do we have any questions in the room? Yes, please, you can step up and tell us your name and perhaps your university and ask your question briefly. Thank you.
My name is Kemal. I'm from Switzerland. I study in Switzerland. And I would like to point out a question relating to United Nations, first of all. Although I took part in United Nations, I think that if there is the veto power in United Nations going on still, United Nations is an unfunctional organization. And also the wars that we had in the past decades, these wars are, as you mentioned, for personal reasons or resources or internal country problems. So I heard somewhere that a solution to the war problem might be empires, not empires, but big countries instead of small ethnic countries, such as European Union, Scandinavia, or United States of America, or other unions. I would like to know, what do you think about these big countries to prevent war?
That's very interesting. Thank you for your question. John, would you like to start? More bigger organizations rather than the small unit. What do you say?
Well, one of the hopes of pacifists after World War I was that we could create some sort of global government that would eliminate war and even the threat of war, just as war has vanished as something that's conceivable between, for example, states here in America, or I would hope between countries in the European Union now. The problem with that is that some of these gigantic empires can be quite warlike. So the United States over the last decade has obviously been quite aggressive and warlike. The attitude toward getting rid of war that I've come away with after looking at all the different theories of war is that to get rid of war, you don't necessarily have to do something dramatic in advance, like creating a global government, getting rid of poverty, getting rid of inequality, having plenty of energy for everybody. To get rid of war, you get rid of war. You focus on militarism itself instead of trying to do something that will then make militarism go away. And my hope is that once people recognize this, and particularly leaders, that they can then start taking steps toward eradicating war once and for all.
Thank you.
Which, of course, has always been the goal of the United Nations and other organizations.
Good. Hans Blix?
Well, I sympathize with the thought, but it presupposes that everybody takes the same view, and not that someone preserves the idea of going to war. But let me say about the United Nations that the UN was created at the end of the Second World War. And the idea was not that we should disarm, there might be hope, but was not the idea. The idea was that those who had fought the war and won the war, the five powers, they were to keep order in the world. It was to create a junta, you might say, warlords, five warlords to keep order. Now, it didn't work very well because we got the Cold War, and they had a hard time to keep peace among themselves. But lately, we have seen what can happen when they are agreed. Now, the first Gulf War in 1991, when Saddam tried to grab Kuwait, then they intervened. They were agreed in the Security Council, and there was an international action. Now, lately, in the case of Syria, again, you found that the US and Russia managed to agree on this demilitarization, taking away the chemical weapons, I should rather say, in Syria. So these two got along, and then they met in the same group as in the Security Council, the great powers, and they transferred from Geneva to New York. Now, you have something similar happening about Iran today, where the P5+1 are discussing with Iran. And so it's the cohesion of the five big warlords, you might say. Now, whether that will last, we don't know. We don't know whether it will last in the Ukraine. But that was the idea. And if you go back in history of this country, Sweden, you also find that sometimes peace was maintained because there was a group of warlords who stuck together. Now, that is not setting up a world organization, but maybe it's on the way.
I am a little worried about the warlords because of course, as John mentioned, that they will keeping peace internally in their regions will be very difficult. Did we have another question here? Yes, please. But I do see your point that it works.
Hi, I'm Jairam from India. So I see that around the world, different superpowers are lining up against each other. Like you said, the US is expanding its base, so is China. So do you think in the near future there can be a spark which ignites a conflict as big as a World War II, maybe?
That's a good, important question. Thank you. Will we have a World War II? Could there be a spark, or World War III, to say, sorry, or whichever way you count? If you count the Cold War, we already did. Said Mamouri.
Well, I think it was already indicated that the risk is there. There are always a risk. Although states, as I also mentioned, they are not as inclined as they were for many years ago to go to war with each other because of their foreign relations interests. And that is one thing. The other thing is that I think the function of international law as means of settling disputes within the states have become more and more important. States avail themselves of these means which are available more and more. And I believe that there are good reasons to hope that there would not be a third world war of the same scale as the world witnessed previously. In the future, most probably, as was also indicated, we will continue to witness small wars here and there, maybe unavoidable for different reasons. But definitely, at least I expect that there would not be a major law, even at the continent level, so to say.
Magnus, do you have something to add?
Well, it's easy to see possibilities of militarized dispute between great powers. And we mentioned some of them earlier, like rivalry between the United States and China being the perhaps most striking candidate for that, some conflict over Taiwan, for example. That seems likely, I think, to occur sometime during the next century. How large that conflict will it be on the scale of a world war similar to the ones we saw during the 20th century? That is very hard to see. But overall, I think that the history shows that wars are very difficult to predict. They are often surprising. They have their own dynamics, so to speak. So it's very difficult to tell.
At the end of this show, we like to ask our guests a blue sky question, to let them put the rational hat aside and put the dreamer hat on. So I would just ask you all very briefly, if you get to mention one thing in the coming years, what would you wish for? In terms of developments of international law and relations, or technological developments, or something that could help build a more peaceful world. What is your wish? Very briefly, because we're running out of time. John Horgan, please.
I would like all world leaders to say that their primary goal is to reach an agreement with other nations to eradicate war once and for all, and then to start formulating a plan to do that, not in the distant future, but as soon as possible, let's say within a generation. And I think once we take that step, then we've already gone a long ways toward making it possible.
Great. Said Mamouri.
I think I wish increased public consciousness about the importance of international law and putting pressure on politicians in order to, let's say, to respect and comply with international law more than what they have done so far. It has happened a lot the last 2 decades, and I hope and I think we can witness more and more of that.
Maja Fjaestad.
Well, I would dream about that the work done to fight climate change would go hand in hand with this, and reduce dependency on fossil fuels and energy efficiency would lead to both a greener and more peaceful world, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Magnus?
Well, I could say things like prosperity and democracy would contribute, because I think those are the main things that have contributed to us having a more peaceful world today. I would also like to mention that very concrete thing that we could make an effort to invest in, and that is peacekeeping. I think peacekeeping is very effective and a very cost efficient thing to do that greatly encourages conflict resolution.
Yeah, great. Very interesting. Hans Blix, last final brief words.
Well, I'm optimistic that war or big wars will not happen in the future. We haven't mentioned the so-called MAD, mutual assured destruction. I think MAD is fading out to what I call MED, mutual economic dependence. I'm much less optimistic about the environment. I mean, we have avoided the quick suicide of a nuclear war, and I think that we are confronting the risk of a slow suicide through the change of the atmosphere. And I do not at all the same line as my friend over here on how we shall approach it. But if there is some wish you'll ask me of, I think it would be a wish of a new enlightenment. I mean, before the Enlightenment in the 18th century, brutality and war and brutality for the sake of brutality was something fairly acceptable. But it's changing. And I mentioned dueling, I mentioned the spanking of children, less use of violence of women and children. Well, I think we need an enlightenment that violence is something that should go out from the human species.
Wish for light there. I would love to continue this discussion, but unfortunately we are out of time here. You, however, can continue this conversation with our professors who will be moving backstage to chat with you online for half an hour. Otherwise, also stay put for our next episode, which begins on the hour. We will take a deeper look at the state of democracy and its challenges in today's world. Please give a big hand to our guests, Said Mahmoudi, Maja Fjaestad, Magnus Reitberger, and John Horgan. Hope to see you back in just a few minutes.